Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry. It's a continuing search for historical knowledge here on YouTube. Alright, today's video comes from our patrons who voted on this video this week, and that is what if JFK was never assassinated by Alternate History Hub. So this is one of those what if something different in history had happened, what would the future after that be, right? So with JFK, big key would be, I guess they'll probably be focusing on is kind of the conduct of the Cold War. It kind of gets its height and then de-escalates in JFK's presidency with things like Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and things like that. But I guess, yeah, you get some what ifs too, further what would go on with the Vietnam War, potentially how that would be affected, or other types of Cold War conflicts, both indirect and direct. So anyway, we'll check this out. If you would like to be a part of polls, if you go down below, you'll see a link to our Patreon, and if you become a member, starting at $1 a month if you'd like, you'll get access to those polls. But thanks for just being here. If you haven't subbed, love to have you around. And if you haven't subbed to this channel, Alternate History Hub, if you go down below and you like this video, you'll see in the description a link to the original video. You want to give them a like, subscription. Great channel there, especially if you're into alternate history, what ifs in history. Those are often fun and kind of interesting to talk about. So let's go ahead and just get started. What if JFK was never assassinated?
President John F. Kennedy is one of the most famous presidents in United States history. He was young and charismatic, and while JFK was quite a special figure in American politics,
he was the youngest president elected, also first Catholic. Basically almost not first, in a way, almost first non-Protestant president, which a lot of people were kind of nervous about when he was running, which was, as a Catholic, would he be more obliged to have to follow Catholic teachings or authority from the Pope or something like that? Kind of interesting. Anyway,
he was far more famous in death. The story of this man struck down so sudden in a public setting both horrified and captivated the world. Lots of people now ask the question, one that I'll try to answer as well. What if JFK was never assassinated? What if he continued to be president throughout most of the 1960s? What would be the effects on American society and maybe even the world? Looking back on the events of his presidency and historical facts, I'll try to predict how this alternate timeline may look if JFK indeed survived.
Okay, so with these, sent us a video, these are always kind of interesting, do you agree with a lot of the things they're going to say? With what do you think would have happened? I'll try to give my take on that. I actually find that with alternate history, a lot of them seem like they do have some logical conclusions. I've done a few of these, or checked out a few of these now. You can see those if you're interested in that and seeing their take. But let's see what you guys think too.
When people imagine a world where JFK lived, it's basically a world where Lyndon Johnson was not president. When Kennedy was killed, LBJ was put into the presidency. While both shared similar domestic views, their qualities as politicians would create much different results for the U.S.
Lyndon B. Johnson was an interesting character. He was a Democrat, but came from Texas, which again has been kind of a largely red state, okay, or a conservative state that way. And presidents have done that in the past, where they'll try to get somebody that they hope helps another demographic, and having someone like that, like to try to have a better reach in other areas. You might pick a running mate that like plays to that, right? And LBJ was like that.
So in this scenario, the most accurate thing to do is ask what Kennedy could have done differently that Johnson wouldn't have, while also looking at the significance Johnson played to shape America today. The 1960s was dominated with racial violence and the rapid growth of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. had been advocating for an end to segregation and other unfair practices since the 1950s. Sure. JFK sympathized with the struggle of the black population, even calling the wife of MLK after his arrest and then pressuring for his release. However, Kennedy was never truly vocal about it until the last few months of his presidency. Why was this? He was worried about losing the support of white Southern Democrats.
Yeah, it's always hard. You do that. You see that with politics, where they do things, but have to be very careful about how it's interpreted, right? Everything's so political with a lot of these decisions. So it's like he wanted to, it seemed like on a personal level, reach out to King's family, but at the same time, worried about the backlash he might get from what support he may have in places that may not like that.
Focused on the upcoming 1960s.
This is always a kind of interesting part of the civil rights movement of how things were portrayed. One of the the big big hot topic points of the 1960s, of course, was communism. It was right at the height of the Cold War, and at the same time you had civil rights movement. And what you saw some people in that were kind of against the civil rights movement is trying to liken the integration of people and desegregation to communism, which again was was something that just struck fear into the hearts of everybody, especially in the 60s. You can see with some of these protesters here, where you say like integration is communism. And if you can liken something to communism in this era, it would immediately like discredit it or be something that people would then look at very differently.
Before election. When he did eventually speak up for civil rights, he argued the debate as a moral one, stressing that if America truly was free, we would treat every American as equal. Public segregation was still in effect across the United States, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education banned it in public schools. Whites from both the North and South didn't want to integrate. His legislation...
Brown versus Board of Education, if you don't know, is a pretty big piece of judicial ruling that ends up basically saying that segregation in education is unequal, right? For so long, the whole separate but equal thing kind of became a go-to for why segregation would be accepted in America, that as long as you have these groups that have access to the thing, right? Even if they're separated, you still have access to that. And what Brown versus Board of Education really, what they showed was they showed that they had these whites-only schools and black-only schools, but the educational quality was demonstrably not the same. So they said that should be justified for saying it, that in education, separate is not equal because of the educational opportunities, he said, was very different. So that was a big moment to kind of get some of the, especially from a legislative standpoint, some of the civil rights things going on, which accumulates in the biggest achievement of the civil rights movement from a law perspective, which is the Civil Rights Act. We'll go back 5 seconds because I think you just started talking about it.
Public schools. Whites from both the North and South didn't want to integrate. His legislation, the Civil Rights Act, was not only to ban segregation in public, but to use the federal government to protect the rights of all races, genders, etc. However, he never got to see his bill pass, as he was killed while he was in committee. It wasn't until LBJ's presidency the following year where the bill was finally passed. So in this alternate timeline where JFK never dies, what happens? The civil rights movement might have actually been set back.
Trying to think why. So it would have been set back. You're saying that him dying accelerated the Civil Rights Act? Let's see where they're going with this.
Why is this? JFK's relationship with Congress was rough to begin with. He beat out Nixon by the slimmest of margins
Very
in the
close.
election.
That was a really, really close election. Nixon ends up winning later, right, in a couple elections after. But yeah, one of the closest ones we had in American history. One of the things, by the way, that JFK is kind of known for in a way, he was young, right, young president, early 40s or whatever when he got elected. And they also say that his election was one of the first of the real mainstream television era, where you had to be able to have a television presence, right? Have that with you on the spot, live, visual kind of thing. And they said that changed politics too, because some people may have great political ideas and stuff like that and be agreed upon, but don't necessarily have that live TV presence. And JFK was said to have that, which helped bolster his image.
Hardly related to the aging Congress, and by his death, his Civil Rights Act was in limbo in the Rules Committee, where it was basically held hostage, planned to never move forward. However, Kennedy's death changed all that. It removed a Northern Democrat from the office and replaced him with a Southern Democrat, LBJ. This,
by the way, is also a time period where, especially with the spun on the Civil Rights Act, you get the big famous kind of shift of the South towards Democrat to Republican. You see that kind of switch. Up to about this era, it's quite the opposite of what it is today, which is people tend to vote more Republican in the southern states, and you see actually that flip. And a lot of people say that's a long discussion. You can look up videos about it and stuff like that and information, but you start to see that shift happening, especially after the civil rights movement, where the South is going to vote more Republican than Democrat, and that's when that shift starts.
Fundamental shift, ironically, saved Kennedy's bill.
Let's go back.
LBJ. This fundamental shift, ironically, saved Kennedy's bill. Johnson carried the torch left by Kennedy, and he was much more vocal about minority rights than even JFK was.
Yeah.
He didn't care about stepping on toes to do it. Just 5 days after JFK's death, LBJ rallied for the passing of the Civil Rights Act, saying that by not doing so would disrespect Kennedy's memory.
So a lot of people, if you really liked him, said, all right, you got to get on board.
LBJ had one thing Kennedy didn't: influence. He had history inside Congress and knew how it worked. He navigated around the tricks they would use. He used his famous Johnson treatment, standing over to convince or straight up intimidate to get those on his side.
Yeah, that was pretty intimidating right there, right? He was a politician's politician. I mean, he knew the system, right? He was the experience and stuff. Probably that JFK might have lacked, right? Because he was young and, yeah.
Even telling one opponent of the bill, if you get in the way, I'm going to run you down. And even after all the political games, navigations, and techniques by the Johnson administration, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 barely passed after 83 days of filibuster. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would not have the political influence or power to push such a bill through.
Interesting. Okay. I really don't. I'm trying to just see if I can agree with that. That it would have just filibustered for the whole time and just delayed and delayed and delayed the Civil Rights Act. That Johnson had that much influence to get people that were lukewarm to the whole Civil Rights Act. I'm not so sure about that, but it's possible to think about.
All the skill of a well-connected Southern Democrat to pass it. A disliked Northerner wouldn't have had a chance.
Yeah, and maybe I'm underestimating Johnson's political abilities. Totally possible.
The act would have either taken much longer, died while in committee, or be considerably weaker than in our timeline. Because of this, MLK and other civil rights leaders would still rally for reform against segregation. Without the federal power to force the states to stop Jim Crow laws, protests and racial violence would be more drawn out.
Jim Crow laws, if you don't know, especially pretty much start after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the ones that specifically give rights to people of all races. Jim Crow laws were designed to basically keep freed African Americans into more subjugated status, right? By putting in laws to maybe make it difficult for them to accept or to practice some of their rights, like put in a literacy or a poll tax to be able to vote, for example.
We would see more police crackdown, firebombings, assassinations, basically just a bloodier path for ending segregation.
That's hard because there's already so many assassinations. I mean, so many key leaders. JFK's brother, Robbie Kennedy, who was very possibly another president, was assassinated. Then, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and leaders of other civil rights groups, NAACP. There were so many assassinations in that decade. It's crazy to think that it could happen even more, but it could be even more violent. So I guess they're saying it would be more violent because the civil rights legislation would have taken longer to pass. Okay. That could be possible.
That would have been passed quicker in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, without the Civil Rights Act, bills like the Voting Rights Act and Title IX would arrive later than in our timeline. They would still occur, however, if Kennedy was still alive, the civil rights movement would have taken a step back simply because JFK didn't have the influence Johnson had. Speaking of Johnson's influence in Congress, LBJ's presidency brought on a lot of immense change to the United States. He used the same tactics for his new legislation reforms, declaring a war on poverty and creating programs for his Great Society. Very similar to FDR with the New Deal.
Well, he worked for FDR, so he was right there. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led the country during the Great Depression and World War II, was big into social programs to get especially out of the Depression, works programs and stuff like that. And LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, was very close to him and was heavily influenced by that, and kind of, yeah, you see it like another New Deal, even though there was a second New Deal, but another type of thing with these government sponsored programs. Definitely want to use the tool of the government to enact change.
Johnson's administration directly led to Medicaid, Medicare,
Right.
PBS, expanded Social Security, created the National Endowment of the Arts, and numerous conservation and housing projects.
Sure.
In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would call for a war on poverty as well. He planned to do the same efforts as Johnson once he was reelected. Johnson's policies were actually just continued plans of JFK's. However, Kennedy never would have expanded his reforms as drastically as LBJ had. Kennedy would have easily defeated the Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. This is without a doubt. Goldwater's Cold War attitude scared many in the U.S., and in our timeline,
Check that out. It's called this ad.
doubt,
Hold on.
Goldwater's
Man, this makes me kind of sad in a way. I don't teach American history more. About the first half of my teaching career, I taught U.S. history as well as world history. I just teach world right now. But I miss doing some of this stuff. This ad, I was always really fun to be able to show. Look it up. It's called Daisy. And it's this little girl, and she's picking this flower, and she's like, 1, 2. I haven't seen it in years, but I remember it. And she's counting it. And yeah, she's this adorable little girl. And then you hear in the background this countdown where it's like 5, 4, 3. And then boom, you see in the bottom left one, boom, this nuclear explosion goes off. And it was like, I forgot, I think there's a text right before this bottom right slide where it's like vote for, it's for Barry Goldwater, but basically saying that like we're going to have nuclear war. Because this is right at the height of the Cold War. If you don't vote for, or if you not for Goldwater, but for President Johnson. Sorry, but rather than Goldwater, but that we're going to have nuclear war without it, because they were saying Goldwater was going to, exacerbate the civil or the war and create like a nuclear war with the Russians. So yeah, it was vote for President Johnson, and it was super like it was a powerful ad. Check it out sometime.
Cold War attitude scared many in the U.S., and in our timeline, it led Johnson to win in one of the most lopsided victories in United States history.
Amazing how you went from that, because Kennedy's was so close, one of the closest ones we've ever had. His first one with Richard Nixon, and then you get it even further. So what you're saying, I guess, in a way, is that people liked what JFK and then LBJ had continued on with. So maybe America liked the changes that were happening here.
He would have won as well and stayed president until 1968. You can't talk about JFK without how he would have handled Vietnam.
This is what I want to
Would
know.
the war have even happened, or would he have fell into the same trap Johnson did and sent American troops into Southeast Asia?
Well, just so you know, America had already been involved with Vietnam even before JFK. That goes back all the way to like Eisenhower and stuff. But I mean, the Vietnam War and America's influence in it changes a lot over the decades, 20 years or so that had some kind of influence. So it was already going on. But JFK is with Johnson, it really becomes a much bigger thing, putting way more troops in and stuff like that.
Well, let's look at Kennedy's mindset during the presidency. Kennedy never wanted to get into Vietnam. He never wanted to involve American troops in a direct war against the North. But JFK wasn't a pushover either. He was a hardline anti-communist, but a realist in return. He knew not every situation resulted in an American victory, but would go through the best efforts to prevent communist expansion in the process. It cannot be understated how much Kennedy distrusted his military advisors. He often went against their opinions, aiming for more peaceful routes. This can be seen in Laos and Cuba, where he didn't escalate the situation to war. Each time JFK did his own
Not close. I mean, if you look at, there was attempted takeovers and like assassination plots and regime changes that America's behind in Cuba against Fidel Castro that didn't go well.
In this alternate timeline, since John F. Kennedy lives to face the greater challenge of Vietnam, the U.S. never gets itself completely involved in the war. JFK distrusted his generals. And
I could see that. That is one I could see, because Johnson and then later Nixon were far more aggressive with it, at least early on, but especially with Johnson.
their over-optimism and conflict. He saw the dangers such a political quagmire would bring. Kennedy tried his hardest to downplay the situation in Vietnam. He knew that the public would quickly call for a war if the communists got the upper hand. He was right. Today we forget how fast Americans rallied for war in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the document that started American involvement, passed overwhelmingly in Congress.
Yeah, that is how America gets into the war. Because one thing it's kind of been interesting about America getting into war is it's supposed to, it's congressional approval, right? You got to get that. And this was in direct response to an assumed attack on an American ship that was over there by kind of the North. What was interesting about Gulf of Tonkin, too, was the fact that it got voted on so quickly after this attack that not a lot of the details came out about it. But in the end, when more investigation happened with this ship getting sunk, it wasn't exactly the story that was portrayed early on in the media and into Congress, that it didn't go down that way, and didn't portray the North as at fault fully for that there was some provocation from the American side in a way. But interesting that because the war is going to get its congressional approval based on some details that were actually not very clear.
Good thing we don't have that rash thinking anymore. It just wasn't in Kennedy's personality
9/11.
as a leader to escalate the situation so far that Lyndon Johnson did. Of course, he was a believer in the Domino Theory and saw the threat North Vietnam posed, but
Domino Theory was this idea, and it was kind of the big thing that people were saying was a justification long term for why Vietnam should not just turn kind of communist in a way. That if they turn communist, that it's going to act like a domino effect, then all of Southeast Asia will follow suit, right? And this containment policy that Americans are kind of living by was, all right, communism exists where it does in China and the Soviet Union, but it should not spread more than that. And yeah, that if Vietnam falls, it'll be like a set of dominoes there in Southeast Asia, and before you know it, the whole region has become communist and allied with America's enemies at that time.
if the war still came, it would have been different. The massive bombing runs, search and destroy, body counts, that was Johnson's solution, not Kennedy's. Even with full American effort to deter North Vietnam, the South would have fell anyway. JFK would have been the president that
Well,
lost
yeah, why would
South
that matter?
Vietnam. I imagine in this alternate timeline, it would be a hot debate today whether America should have gotten involved. From a simple human cost, over 60,000 American soldiers and countless Vietnamese don't die in the fighting. Of course, considerable Vietnamese still die, but not at the level as in our timeline. Without the Vietnam War, the relationship between US citizens and the government is different. The images that they saw every night were not supporting the story of a successful war the Johnson administration boasted.
That was one of the biggest things. The Vietnam War was the first war in American history that basically was able to get nightly visual coverage, right? Because this is the television age. And generally speaking, we found that people before television trusted the government more than they did after television. Because before television, the government was much more likely to be able to control sort of the message of things, especially with wars, right? Because a lot of what you heard about the war came from government spokesmen. But in Vietnam, it was different. And again, there was these conflicting things happening where the government's saying, hey, the war is actually going really well. But then you have major trusted news anchors like Walter Cronkite, who was out saying, hey, like trying to, he was, news anchors and stuff try to avoid bias in a way, but it's like, hey, I was told we were winning. And then you look at these things that end up happening and seeing the footage, and it made people distrust their government more. And that's kind of been one of the biggest legacies of Vietnam.
Or more accurately, counterculture of the 1960s would still have existed. Counterculture was created by many different factors, from civil rights, feminism, to simple rebellion against the Leave It to Beaver family of the 1950s. Sorry, Nixon, hippies still would have existed. However, the anti-war movement against Vietnam expanded counterculture to college kids and young people, those personally affected by the draft. Without the war, this counterculture would have taken much longer to appear in American society. In this alternate timeline, it's likely Johnson and Nixon would both run for the presidency. However, it's difficult to predict who would win. Much of the scenario becomes extremely complex, too much for the size of this video. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. Why was Kennedy so significant? He only served around 2 years in office. How did he leave such a lasting impact? I believe it was because Kennedy embodied the hopeful future of America. Resilient, clever, his dream was America's dream, but his sudden tragic end put an end to that and brought on the reality. Following JFK's death, there was certainly a change. The race riots, culture shift, Americans bogged down overseas. The 60s and 70s were tough decades for the United States, and so looking back, it's not difficult to see JFK as that last glimmering hope of what could have been. There certainly was lots of progress after his death, but there was also certainly lots of distrust, tension, and rebellion as well.
Well, it sounds like that they're just saying, I mean, you could say the Vietnam War happens, but the involvement of America is later. Unless they're also trying to say that without America's involvement, the North, which was the communist part of Vietnam, would have won sooner, which is definitely possible. And like they said, probably would have won anyways. But that maybe could have happened sooner. So maybe America never gets involved. If, again, you think that the North would just have won if you had waited until either Nixon or LBJ get elected in '68. If Kennedy had served two full terms, right? So the war had been over by then. That's possible too.
Maybe things would have been different had JFK lived. We'll never truly know. This is just one scenario out of the countless possibilities. Like on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.
Hey guys, I'm Chris, and here is my list of the
Lego
top
gun?
10 deadliest assassins. Now, for the record, I'm talking about actual contract killers whose profession is killing discreetly. It's as much about the style and success of the killing as it is how many people they actually kill.
Like Keanu Reeves. Okay. All right. So what do you guys think? Do you agree with this timeline? So I guess the major points they were saying is the civil rights movement would have been extended, most likely because the Civil Rights Act and some of the similar legislation would have taken longer to pass, which I could see that happening. Because you do see with the two men, Kennedy and Johnson, that Kennedy was, it seemed like, a little more reluctant. He believed in a lot of, I think, all those things that Johnson ends up doing, but was a little bit more politically conscious of it, that he didn't want to offend certain people, where Johnson didn't care. He didn't care if you weren't with these pieces of legislation he puts out with his works programs, war on poverty and civil rights stuff, that he was in your face about it right away. He wasn't holding back nearly as much. So I could see that definitely happening. The Vietnam War stuff is it never happened from the American perspective. Again, I'm kind of torn. I'd have to think about it more, which would have been what I said about a minute ago, which was, if America doesn't get involved, does that mean the North would have went and defeated the South before Kennedy's term, if he had served 2 full terms, would have ended? Because if that's not the case, if it wouldn't have necessarily ended like that, then yeah, you probably could. You very likely you would have seen, whether it was Nixon or Johnson, when they come in '68, that you would have seen American involvement get then, because you see them be more aggressive minded with that. So I could see that happening as well. So nothing here I think that was way off of what I would kind of think. I mean, some of the timelines of things, you just never know. But I don't know, nothing too, I don't think, out of the possibility of a timeline there. What do you guys think, though? Do you think this is fairly accurate? What about going forward after this? Because they really just kind of end it with the Johnson, maybe Nixon thing there. One that they didn't necessarily talk about was, would you have had the political shift in the South if not for Lyndon B. Johnson? The switch from the South then starting to vote Republican when they had voted Democrat for so long. I wonder if that would have continued that way, because it was definitely in large part due to the Civil Rights Act. But I don't know, maybe so. Maybe that just would have been delayed as well, just kind of like what they were saying with Vietnam. Maybe that's probably where I would probably think maybe that shift does happen. It just takes a little longer because the Civil Rights movement would have been delayed few years. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Well, anyways, get a discussion down below if you would like, or better yet, come join our Discord server if you haven't yet. We got a lot of people on there that love to talk history, and if you keep it civil, it's a good place to be. So, link down below for that. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this video was chosen by our patron pledgers. If you'd like to get involved in that, go down below. You'll see a link down there. If you like the original video, go down below as well. Basically, just go to the description and check out all the links, and that would be very appreciated. All right. With that, thanks for hanging out here. Thanks for being a part of the history community here on YouTube, supporting history education. I really appreciate that. Hope to see you around very soon, and we'll see you next time. Bye.